They said you need to leave, so she owned the bank. In the hushed marble lounge of Summit Wealth Bank, echoes of wealth and privilege swirl around gleaming columns until the branch manager's icy dismissal cuts through the air like a knife. Isabella Rossi, CEO and majority owner, stands stunned as her platinum access card is brushed aside. Around her, private clients freeze mid-sip, smartphones hover in midair, and a charged silence crackles with the weight of unspoken bias. This is more than a protocol glitch. It's a raw display of racial prejudice in real time. But in the next 10 minutes, an empire shifts on its axis. What would you do if you were erased from the place you own? Hit subscribe, ring the bell, and tell us in the comments, how far would you go to reclaim your dignity? Stay tuned, justice is about to be served. Isabella Rossi took a steadying breath and surveyed the lounge with the cool appraisal of a strategist. The room's plush leather chairs, crystal decanters, and hushed conversations seemed to shrink beneath the enormity of her presence and the enormity of the insult she had just endured. At 10:17 a.m., the branch manager's words, icy and precise, had landed like a gavel. You need to leave. 8 words that reduced a billionaire CEO to a non-entity in her own domain. She had arrived that morning with purposeful calm. No entourage, no designer bag, no telltale signs of her status beyond a discreet platinum card. She walked through the glass doors of Summit Wealth Bank's private lounge as if entering her own boardroom. The polished marble underfoot, the warming glow of morning light, the faint scent of espresso, all felt like home. Until it wasn't. In an instant, she was made to feel like an interloper, a person presumed guilty of merely being the wrong color in the wrong seat. The manager's clipped tone and averted gaze cut deeper than any insult. They exposed the raw nerve of systemic bias. Another client's stifled cough. The glint of a smartphone camera and the shifting weight of onlookers made her pulse quicken, but her face betrayed nothing. Isabella opened her purse, slid out her platinum card, and laid it on the mahogany counter. The card bore her name, her title, the bank's seal, and her right to be there. But the manager wouldn't meet her eye. Instead, she gestured toward the exit with a curt nod as though dispatching an intruder from sacred ground. Behind that gesture lay years of unspoken prejudice, the assumption that a black woman, no matter how accomplished, could not truly belong. Her mind raced through the halls of every boardroom where her voice had moved markets and every crisis zone where her decisions had saved lives. Each memory fueled her resolve. This wasn't a personal slight. It was a test of power, a litmus test for the bank she controlled. And she would not fail. She took a single step forward, her heels clicking on the marble floor, each click resonating like a heartbeat. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I believe you've made an error." The lounge seemed to hold its breath. Guests who had been comfortably ensconced in leather armchairs now leaned forward, sensing the gravity of her words. A smartphone camera flicked on its red light, casting a silent spotlight on the confrontation. The manager hesitated, glancing around as if seeking support. But in that moment, support arrived in the form of Isabella's own team, summoned with a silent signal. Her general counsel slipped through the side door, followed by her PR director, phones and notepads at the ready. The tide was turning. What had begun as a private humiliation was morphing into a public reckoning. Isabella met the manager's faltering gaze. "If you have a policy that bars me from this space," she continued, "please show it to me." Her fingers remained curled around the countertop and her eyes shone with unspoken command. The manager fumbled for papers, an outdated memo, an irrelevant bulletin, none of which bore Isabella's name or authority. Each crumpled excuse only amplified the absurdity of the situation. Guests exchanged glances, some disapproving, some curious. A discreet live stream feed had begun, and viewers around the world were tuning in to watch a bank's veneer of civility crack under the weight of bias. The silent hum of air conditioning and distant city traffic faded, replaced by the charged stillness of a room witnessing history. With measured grace, Isabella reached for her phone. A quick text to the bank's COO, activate Protocol 6. Board meeting in lounge. Another to legal document, every moment, prepare notice. Those digital commands echoed like thunder, signaling that the era of passive endurance was over. The manager's lip quivered. She realized that the power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Isabella wasn't just defending her right to be served, She was defending the dignity of every client, every employee, every observer who had ever been dismissed because of prejudice masked as procedure. In that suspended moment, the Marble Lounge became a courtroom and Isabella Rossi the judge. The branch manager's trembling hand reached for a phone, but Isabella raised a single finger. "No calls," she said softly. "Not yet." Her calm clarity cut through the tension. This was not about revenge or spectacle. It was about justice. And in the next 10 minutes, every assumption the bank had made about power, race, and respect would be rewritten. Late morning light filtered through the towering glass facade of Summit Wealth Bank, casting elongated patterns across the marble foyer. Isabella Rossi stepped through the revolving doors with unassuming confidence. She wore a pale cashmere sweater and dark wash jeans, an ensemble decidedly low-key for the woman whose name graced the boardroom of Summit Enterprises, a global conglomerate now valued at over $8 billion. Her lack of entourage, the absence of a designer handbag or flashing jewelry, was intentional. Today was a test of prejudice masked as protocol. She walked past the gilded chandeliers and the hushed whispers of polished clientele, carrying only a slim tablet case, her digital ledger of wealth. Security cameras tracked her path, recognizing the discreet VIP badge clipped to her lapel. As she approached the private client desk, the teller offered a professional nod, barely glancing at Isabella's credentials before swiping her card and motioning toward the velvet rope. "Right this way, Miss Rossi," he said, his tone polite but neutral. Inside the glass partition lounge, the air felt different, softer, hushed, insulated from the bustle of the main hall. Plush leather chairs were arranged around lacquered coffee tables, and crystal decanters of sparkling water glinted in the ambient light. Isabella paused at the edge of the room, taking in the serene luxury she had paid for and owned. For many, this space symbolized wealth and privilege. For her, it was simply her headquarters away from headquarters. She approached the counter and requested her transaction, a straight $500,000 withdrawal. The teller processed her request with quiet efficiency, producing a stack of freshly printed slips and a bank check. Isabella scanned the document, her lips tightening in satisfaction, then tucked the check into her tablet case. She exhaled, ready to settle into a moment of private reflection over the numbers that danced across her mind. But that calm shattered in an instant. From the polished corridor beyond the lounge stepped the branch manager, Karen Miller, her face a mask of disapproval. Karen's stride was purposeful, the sharp click of her heels announcing her arrival. Isabella looked up, offering a polite smile. Instead of greeting her, Karen's gaze slid past the CEO's credentials, as though they didn't exist. She folded her arms and said, "Your appointment is canceled." Isabella blinked. The words echoed in the silent room. "Canceled?" She repeated, her voice steady, but laced with incredulity. "I'm here for my withdrawal." Karen's lips curved into a cool half-smile. "I'm sorry, Ms. Rossi, but this lounge is reserved for verified clients only." Her eyes drifted to Isabella's cashmere sweater, then to her jeans as if inspecting a fabric that should not belong in such a setting. A hush fell among the scattered guests. Isabella's chest tightened, not from anger, but from the sting of disbelief. She had acquired Summit Wealth Bank 2 years earlier in a landmark deal. Yet here she was being denied access to her own institution. The irony struck like a blow. The very establishment she now owned was erasing her in real time. She placed her tablet case on the lacquered counter, letting it thud softly. "I am a verified client," she said, her tone measured. "I am the owner of this bank." Karen's eyes flicked toward the tablet case, then away. "I'm not aware of any such arrangement," she said, turning away as if the matter were closed. But Isabella had built her career on closing deals, not conceding to power plays. Behind her, a discreet pool of witnesses had formed, an elderly couple waiting for their private consultation, a young tech entrepreneur checking her phone, and a handful of bankers conducting meetings inside offices. All witnessed the CEO's credentials being treated like scraps of paper. Isabella inhaled, feeling the familiar hum of adrenaline she experienced before every crucial negotiation. Her mind cataloged every boardroom conquest, every pressed handshake with world leaders, every moment she'd turned a stumbling block into a stepping stone. This would be no different. She opened her tablet, hands unmoving, as her general counsel and PR director emerged from the lounge entrance, summoned by the silent signal she'd sent minutes before. They took positions, one near the exit in case the manager attempted to bar her physically, the other ready to capture any misstep for the public record. Their presence was a reminder that Isabella never faced negotiations alone. Karen Miller's expression shifted, a flicker of uncertainty seeping into her practiced composure. She cleared her throat. "Please retrieve your things and leave the lounge," she said, raising her voice enough for the onlookers to hear. Isabella met her gaze unwavering. "My things are here," she replied quietly, "and I'm not leaving until you explain the policy you're citing." Her voice carried the weight of authority that only decades of leadership could command. Karen hesitated. The room held its breath. Then she uttered the script she'd been trained on. Security protocol requires enhanced verification for any cash withdrawal over $250,000. We must ensure compliance with anti-money laundering regulations. The excuse hung in the air, but it rang hollow. Isabella's bank had pioneered those very regulations. She had lobbied for stricter global standards after overseeing crisis zones where illicit funds fueled violence. She knew the protocols by heart, and they bore no mention of color attire or clientele distinctions beyond cold, hard data. She slid her tablet across the counter toward Karen. The screen displayed a pop-up Board Resolution 2023-44, authorizing all executive transactions to proceed without manual review and owner access protocol, granting her unimpeded entry. Karen's eyes widened as she read, her carefully maintained facade cracking. But before she could respond, a white investment banker in a designer suit sauntered into the lounge. Chadwick Vance glanced at the unfolding drama with casual amusement. "Next, please," he quipped, his tone dripping condescension. He snatched the tablet off the counter and slid it toward himself. "Let me see those credentials," he demanded, his smirk suggesting the tablet was a curious toy rather than the key to a fortune. Isabella's pulse quickened as Chadwick's fingers hovered over her digital proof. The room tensed. The teller's face went pale. But Karen's eyes flared with indignation. Her authority had been challenged. Erica gently lifted Chadwick's hand, ignoring the simmering insult. "Return that now," she said, her voice calm but unbreakable. "Or consider yourself complicit in theft." Her words carried the precision of a lifetime spent negotiating multi-billion-dollar deals. Chadwick recoiled, nearly dropping the tablet, and retreated with a bitter laugh. Karen reached for the landline, probably to call security, but Isabella moved faster. From her pocket, she produced her phone, tapped a quick text to Anita. Her executive assistant, Phase 1, complete. Proceed to branch director level. Moments later, the branch director himself, Leo Hastings, appeared in the doorway. His crisp suit and polished shoes radiated corporate weight. He approached the counter, scanning the scene with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Isabella looked up, meeting his eyes. "Director Hastings," she said, voice unwavering, "could you confirm my access rights?" Hastings swallowed. He recognized the CEO's name badge before he recognized the person, a miscalculation compounded by the afternoon's unfolding prejudice. He checked his tablet, squinted, then nodded. "Miss Rossi, you have full executive privileges. I apologize for the misunderstanding." Karen Miller's lips parted, but no apology came. Instead, she folded her arms and gave Isabella a curt nod before melting back into the lounge's periphery. The guests exhaled, the tension breaking like waves on stone. Isabella closed her tablet with a quiet click. "Thank you," she said to Hastings, her tone formal but not warm. She collected her tablet case and walked past the velvet rope as though born to that space, which indeed she was. As she settled into a chair at the far corner of the lounge, the morning sunlight shifted across her profile, revealing a smile that was both satisfied and resolute. Her PR director leaned in. "Shall we release the statement now?" she asked softly. Isabella shook her head. "Not yet," she replied. "They need time to feel the weight of what happened." Her gaze swept the lounge's survivors, bankers, clients, security staff, each carrying an unspoken lesson about bias and power. In this silent tableau, the real work had just begun. And so the stage was set. Within 10 minutes, the bank's executive board would convene in the very room they thought no less deserving than any other. Protocols would be rewritten, policies reframed, and Summit Wealth Bank's legacy, like Isabella's own empire, would be redefined in the light of unwavering justice. Late morning light streamed through the soaring windows of the private client lounge, but for Isabella Rossi, the brightness had dimmed. She sat poised in a leather armchair, her cashmere sweater and jeans a deliberate contrast to the opulence around her. Before her lay the tablet displaying Board Resolution 2023-44, the digital proof of her authority. proof that should have ended any dispute. Yet at that moment, the branch manager, Karen Miller, cut through the calm like a winter gale. Karen's heels clicked sharply on the marble floor as she strode forward, eyes narrowed and jaw set. She carried herself with the practiced precision of someone accustomed to unquestioned power over lesser mortals. Seeing Isabella, who sat with the quiet confidence of a woman who had built empires, seemed to ignite a spark of indignation in Karen's chest. "We need proof of funds." Karen snapped, her voice cold and clipped. Her hand shot out, intercepting the tablet, just as Isabella lifted it to show her the board resolution. The screen froze mid-slide, the soft glow flickering in disbelief. Isabella's raised eyebrow conveyed the same thought disbelief that policy could be weaponized against the very person who had rewritten the rules. Around them, the private lounge fell into a strange hush. A white investment banker in a tailored navy suit, Chadwick Vance, hovered nearby, his smirk spreading like oil on water. With a deliberate flick of his wrist, he knocked the tablet aside. It slid across the mahogany table, clattering onto the floor. The sound was a trigger all at once, the laughter in the main banking hall, the whispering conversations in the side rooms, and the gentle hum of the AC unit seemed to vanish, replaced by the cold echo of Chadwick's insult. Isabella rose, each movement controlled, measured. She could have seized the tablet back, confronted Chadwick physically, or unleashed a verbal tirade worthy of every boardroom she had ever dominated. But she did none of those things. Instead, she allowed the moment to breathe, to expand until the weight of prejudice masquerading as policy was palpable to everyone in the room. A private banker. Brittany Foster leaned against a nearby pillar, arms crossed, her lips curled into a disdainful half-smile. Her voice cut through the tension like a scalpel. "That cash doesn't add up," she murmured, just loud enough for those nearest to hear. In her words lay the seed of suspicion that Isabella's request for a $500,000 withdrawal was nothing more than a bank heist in designer sweater form. Isabella held their gazes with unflinching calm. 2 decades of achievement, of negotiating billion-dollar contracts, of advising heads of state, of rescuing companies from collapse, vanished behind the veil these three had drawn. They saw her not as the owner of the bank, but as an interloper, a woman of color whose credentials could be ignored at whim. She pocketed her tablet and studied Karen. "Is that the policy you're citing?" she asked, voice soft yet edged with steel. "Show me the document that requires me to prove the origins of funds when I am the owner of this institution." Each syllable landed with the weight of her many accomplishments, unspoken but impossible to ignore. Rhodes Scholar, decorated humanitarian, pioneering CEO. Karen's lips thinned. She opened her mouth, summoned the rehearsed jargon. Anti-money laundering regulations, she said, require enhanced verification for withdrawals over $250,000. Her tone implied she had said something profound, as though she had just unveiled a cosmic truth. Isabella let the words hang in the air. Then she recited from memory the very regulations Karen cited. Regulations she had personally helped draft during her tenure on the Global Banking Standards Committee. These regulations, Isabella said, apply to unknown clients depositing unverified funds. They do not apply to the owner of the bank whose transactions are auto-approved under Board Resolution 2023-44, Section 3.2. Her voice was calm, each word chosen to cut through the pretense. The room stirred. A couple seated at a corner table exchanged glances, their afternoon espresso forgotten. A tech entrepreneur paused mid-laptop tap, sensing that something historic was unfolding before her eyes. The banker Chadwick saw his smirk falter as he realized Isabella had rendered his attack impotent with a single sentence. Brittany's arms dropped to her sides. She opened her mouth, then closed it. She had no further retort, no policy citation deeper than her own bias. The managers and bankers in the room had all been trained to recite generic explanations to hide prejudice behind sanitized corporate speak. Isabella had exposed their script as nothing more than an armor for unacknowledged discrimination. A hush descended as Isabella allowed them to reflect on the fragility of their position. No one had dared to question the policies when the clients were wealthy white men wearing pinstriped suits. But when the client was a black woman with a quiet wardrobe, suddenly protocol became a cudgel. Isabella turned and looked directly at Chadwick. She spoke softly, but with undeniable clarity. "You may knock down my proof. You may quote me regulations, but you cannot deny the fact that I own this bank. and you cannot deny the power you have so casually wielded here." Her calm fury resonated like the echo of a gavel. The private lounge, once an enclave of privilege, had become a crucible of truth. Clients and bankers alike felt the shift prejudice had been laid bare, and now they were witnesses to its unraveling. A low murmur rose, whispers of acknowledgement, murmurs of solidarity. Isabella allowed a moment for the transformation to settle. Then she retrieved her tablet case from the chair beside her, the leather soft under her fingertips. "I will not ask again," she said, her voice final. "Return my tablet. Verify my credentials or step aside." Chadwick moved first, perhaps realizing the general counsel watching from the doorway was about to step in. He bent to pick up the tablet, his fingers brushing Isabella's in a gesture he meant as apology, but which felt more like reluctant surrender. He handed it back with a stiff nod. Karen Miller looked away, her facade cracking as the weight of her own actions pressed upon her. The reality was unavoidable. She had dismissed her own employer, an act that would cost her far more than any regulatory fine. Isabella opened the tablet, tapped to the board resolution, and displayed it once more. This time, no one interfered. The digital text glowed under the marble lights, an unassailable declaration of her authority. She returned to her seat, the tablet resting on her lap like a crown. "Thank you," she said, her tone gracious but firm. "Let us proceed." She pressed a button and the lounge's ambient music shifted from the taunting silence into a soft cascade of piano notes, an acknowledgement that the crisis had passed and a new order had been established. As she leaned forward to complete her withdrawal, Isabella caught the eyes of several onlookers. The tech entrepreneur, the elderly couple, even Chadwick, who seemed to contemplate the folly of mocking someone you don't truly know. In those glances, she saw something profound, an unspoken recognition that dignity once denied demands restitution. When the bank manager Karen finally stepped back behind the mahogany counter, she offered a curt, "Your funds are ready, Miss Rossi," her tone hollow with shame. Isabella smiled an expression of both triumph and compassion. In that moment, the unjust barrier erected by prejudice had crumbled under the weight of truth. The private lounge reclaimed its purpose, a place for genuine clients to be served without fear of concealed bias. Isabella gathered her cash and tablet, rose from her chair, and met Karen's gaze one final time. "Let us not forget this lesson," she said quietly. "The next time policy stands in the way of people rather than protecting them." Then, with her quiet confidence restored, she walked out of the lounge, her boots echoing on the marble floor like the sound of justice served. Late morning sun filtered through the champagne-tinted windows of the private lounge, painting the marble floor in warm gold. Yet for Isabella Rossi, every beam felt like a spotlight on her indignity. She sat perched at the edge of a plush leather chair, mind racing beneath the serene calm of her pale cashmere sweater. Around her, bank staff and clients moved in slow motion, a silent tableau frozen by the injustice she faced. Her pulse throbbed in her ears, a relentless drumbeat that echoed the memory of far more harrowing moments. She remembered the first time she'd walked into a Fortune 500 boardroom at age 28, her fresh MBA pressed close to her chest, eyes flicking over a room of skeptical faces before she pitched a billion-dollar merger. She recalled the crackle of radios in a Syrian desert coordinating the airlift of her company's safe haven shelters as mortars rained overhead. That same steel nerve honed in boardrooms and battlefields now coiled inside her. 2 steps away, the branch manager Karen Miller hovered like a specter of arrogance. Her clipped request for proof of funds had shattered etiquette. "We need verification," she'd said, voice as cold as the marble underfoot. No acknowledgement of Isabella's platinum card. No deferential preamble. Just the flat declaration that a woman who owned the bank was a suspect. With each passing heartbeat, Isabella felt the weight of that refusal. The room's soft hum of ambient music and hushed conversation had turned into a cacophony of whispered judgments. The investment banker Chadwick Vance leaned against a gilded pillar and let loose a derisive chuckle. He knocked her documents to the floor as though erasing her authority with a flick of his cuffed wrist. Across the table, Brittany Foster, the private banker with perfectly coiffed hair and a designer pen behind her ear, whispered to a colleague that Isabella's withdrawal didn't add up. They saw her nameplate, no doubt. They saw the silk threads of her scarf, the understated sparkle of her ring. But they refused to see the woman behind them, the founder of Summit Enterprises, the majority stakeholder who had shepherded the bank through its most profitable year since acquisition. They reduced her to their own narrow assumptions, a caricature of wealth they could mock behind scripted excuses about protocol and policy. Isabella pressed her fingertips into the soft leather of the armrest, grounding herself. The indignity seared through her composure, but she did not flinch. Instead, she let the silence gather like storm clouds, thick with tension, until every person in the lounge felt the electric charge of that moment. She inhaled the polished air tinged with a faint hint of espresso and the distant scent of polished wood, and allowed her fury to crystallize. This was the crucible. Here in the gilded enclave meant only for real clients she would not be dismissed. She had once stood alone in a Wharton lecture hall and debated global heads of state. She had negotiated contracts worth hundreds of millions in languages she barely spoke. She had designed shelters that saved lives before the sun rose. Yet now a simple lounge attendant could erode her identity with a polite refusal. A soft cough punctuated the stillness. It came from Liu Zhang, a young tech entrepreneur seated discreetly in the corner, his phone half lowered as if he'd just realized the magnitude of what he was witnessing. Next to him, Marcus James, a tall attorney who frequently advised Isabella's board, straightened in his seat. Their quiet solidarity was a beacon she was not alone. Her mind flicked back to the countless times she had tempered her strength, meticulously calibrating her tone so that her directives would be heard rather than dismissed. In crisis zones, she'd learned that rage could be a battlefield liability, but that was then when lives hung in the balance. Now in this sanctum of privilege, her refusal would be the spark for real change. Isabella closed her eyes, summoning the calm she needed. She pictured the survivors huddled inside her safe havens. She remembered the gratitude in a mother's eyes when her child was finally safe. She felt the weight of millions depending on her to speak truth to power. That memory was her anchor, and she breathed in its strength. When she opened her eyes, the marble lounge seemed smaller, more enclosed, but her purpose was larger than any gilded room. She lifted her chin, each movement deliberate. The branch manager's forced smile faltered under the precision of Isabella's gaze. In a voice just above a whisper, yet carrying like thunder, Isabella said, "I have shown you my credentials, my board resolution, my authority. Now show me the policy that denies me service in a space reserved for my own clients." Her tone was soft, yet edged with steel, an unspoken promise that this injustice would not stand. The lounge manager shuffled papers behind the mahogany desk. Her carefully coiffed hair trembled as though caught in a wind of her own fear. There was no policy to show. No regulation that could justify refusing the CEO of the bank entry to the private lounge she owned. That unanswerable truth hovered between them like a guillotine waiting for the final tilt of a head to fall. Isabella stood, her cashmere sleeve brushing against the arm of the chair. She felt the eyes of every client, every banker, every hidden camera, aware that her response in this crucible would become a masterclass in confronting bias. She would not flinch. She would not lower her voice further. She was here to reclaim her dignity, and she would do so on her terms. For a fleeting second, the world held its breath. Then the soft whir of a security camera motor sounded, echoing the resolve inside her. The inner storm had reached its apex, and dignity had become purpose, prejudice, had become a catalyst for change. And in that silent heartbeat, Isabella Rossi, owner of Summit Wealth Bank, prepared to shatter the unjust barrier before her. Late morning sunlight glinted off the glass partitions as whispers curled through the private lounge like tendrils of smoke. Smartphones lifted cameras trained on the unfolding drama, the CEO of Summit Enterprises reduced to a spectacle. The polished marble floor, once a symbol of exclusivity, felt suddenly like the confines of a gilded cage. Every gleam in the opulent brass fixtures now mocked Isabella Rossi's predicament. A low hum of lounge jazz drifted from hidden speakers, its smooth saxophone melody warping into something taunting. The notes curved through the air and collided with the tension gathering at the mahogany desk, where Karen Miller still hovered, arms crossed. Her curt demand for proof of funds had shattered the unspoken code of corporate courtesy, and now each tick of the ornate lobby clock seemed to underscore the imbalance. One of the world's most powerful women was being profiled, accused, humiliated, in a room she had every right to occupy. Isabella sat perfectly still, her denim jeans and cashmere sweater belying the simmering resolve beneath. She watched as clients craned their necks, their faces a mix of shock, curiosity, and tentative sympathy. A businessman in a tailored navy suit leaned forward, smartphone poised for a clandestine video. Across the room, a woman in her 60s adjusted her designer scarf and whispered to her companion, "Isn't that the bank's owner?" The companion offered a nod, eyes widening. Through it all, Isabella's gaze remained unbroken. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks, not from anger, but from the intensity of the moment. Every whispered slight, every flicker of pity or contempt pressed against her like the weight of an unseen crowd. She'd weathered hostile boardrooms and brutal negotiations. She'd faced down bureaucrats and mercenary contractors. But this public exhibition struck at the heart of her identity in a way no balance sheet ever could. Behind her, Marcus James, her longtime legal advisor, shifted in his seat. His presence was a silent promise she was not alone. Next to him, Leo Zhang, the tech entrepreneur who had befriended her at a recent industry summit, lowered his phone. His red recording light still glowed, but he'd heeded her earlier plea. Words, not lenses. Now the quiet gravity of his stance spoke volumes. Isabella drew a slow breath, letting the melody of the jazz fade into a low thrum in her mind. The rhythm of tension synchronized with her own heartbeat. Thump, thump, thump. Each pulse emphasized the absurdity of being treated as unverified in the bank she owned. The ambient hum of espresso machines from the adjacent cafe, the distant clatter of cups. Even the muted murmur of an unseen security guard, the world continued oblivious to her storm of indignation. Around the lounge, the staff exchanged uneasy glances. Brittany Foster, the private banker who's whispered that cash doesn't add up, had ignited the crisis, leaned against the wall, arms folded. Her eyes flickered with a mixture of triumph and trepidation. Chadwick Vance, the smug investment banker, hovered nearby like a vulture, his expensive gray suit immaculate, his smirk unwavering. He tapped his foot against the marble, the subtle sound echoing like a metronome counting down to Isabella's breaking point. Yet she did not break. Instead, she allowed the moment to crystallize around her. This was no longer a person versus policy dispute. It was a confrontation between centuries of bias and a singular act of defiance. She felt time stretch each second, laden with unspoken questions. How many other women had been profiled here? How many other people of color had been forced to prove their worth in a space they helped build? Each glance in her direction carried the weight of those collective experiences. Isabella closed her eyes, momentarily recalling the first time she'd walked into the summit of Forbes' world's most powerful CEOs. Back then, she'd styled her hair in a conservative chignon, chosen a suit that blended in rather than stood out, tempered her speech to avoid rattling the old guard. That strategy had worked until today. Now the same subtlety was weaponized against her. Their silence had become hostility, their polite protocol a facade for prejudice. When she reopened her eyes, the room fell into sharper focus. She noticed the tremor in the receptionist's hands as she wiped her name badge, the tightening of Brittany's jaw, the flicker of doubt in Chadwick's eyes as he realized the magnitude of his own entitlement. Even behind his impassive facade, the branch manager Karen Miller's posture had stiffened, her confidence fraying at the edges. On a quiet exhale, Isabella let the tension swell one final time. Then, with the precision of a conductor's baton, she called the silence into action. Her voice, soft yet undeniably present, cut through the jazz and the whispers. "This is your moment," she said, eyes sweeping the room. "You can either stand silent and complicit, or you can stand with justice." She paused, letting the question hang in the thick air. Which will it be? The effect was electric. A hush fell over the lounge. Phones lowered, conversations stilled. Even the forgotten espresso machine seemed to pause in anticipation. In that charged silence, hearts raced, minds turned inward. The clients, once mere spectators, now confronted their own biases. The staff, once unquestioning enforcers of protocol, faced the reality of the policy they defended. And in that suspended moment, the gilded cage dissolved. The marble columns and plush chairs no longer symbolized exclusivity, but the very stage for dismantling injustice. The lounge's polished opulence had transformed into a crucible of accountability. Isabella's calm defiance had rewritten the script. No longer would bias hide behind bureaucratic jargon or soft smiles. As the tension peaked, Isabella held her ground, embodying the promise of action anchored in dignity. The rising chorus of support, a single cough, a tentative murmur. The soft rise of hands began to ripple outward. The room tilted, then shifted. The barrier of prejudice cracked, and through it the sunlight of equity poured in, illuminating every smirk, every tremor, every chance for change. And at that precise instant, a security lead's voice cut through. We need to address this now. The first step toward resolution had arrived, but the opulent lounge, once a theater of exclusion, had already witnessed its own transformation. The private room's opulence had morphed into a battleground for justice, and Isabella Rossi, CEO, owner, human, had ignited the reckoning. Late morning's warmth had seeped through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the private lounge, but Isabella Rossi felt a chill as she unclipped the discreet earpiece glinting at her collar. Around her, the cafe's soft lighting and polished marble lent an air of serenity so belied by the storm gathering at the mahogany counter. Her pulse was a controlled drumbeat in her ears, steady, resolute. She leaned forward just enough to meet Karen Miller's eyes, calm lines of authority etched into every feature. Beneath that surface lay years of corporate diplomacy, nonprofit negotiations, and late-night crisis protocols. Yet today, those carefully honed skills served a singular purpose: to expose the prejudice masquerading as policy. Show me the policy that denies my request. Isabella said, voice level and precise. Not a tremor, not a quaver, just the steel-edged insistence of a woman unaccustomed to having her citizenship in her own bank questioned. Karen's carefully coiffed bob bobbed as she straightened, clutching a leather binder filled with the day's client files. She cleared her throat, flipping through the pages as though a written mandate might materialize at her touch. It's a system error, she tried. Voice clipped. We've had an overbooking in the high-value withdrawal queue. Protocol requires additional verification. Protocol. Isabella echoed softly. She could almost hear the false creak of an overused justification. Please, the clause number, the exact wording. Karen stumbled, glancing at the silent rows of staff and clients watching. She managed a stiff smile and rummaged in the binder some more. Section 4.3.2 states that in the event of a system discrepancy, the branch manager may request supplementary documents. It's standard. Isabella's lips curved in a polite half-smile. Standard, she repeated, for whom? Beneath that measured tone lay a torrent of suppressed fury. She lowered her gaze to the counter, letting the weight of her presence settle over the marble surface. I own 81% of this institution. I built the systems that define those protocols. Yet here your standard apparently doesn't recognize me. A bead of sweat appeared at Karen's hairline. She offered another excuse, raising her voice just enough for the nearest client to flinch. We've had reports of unauthorized withdrawals. We're following the governing guidelines handed down by compliance. Isabella lifted her eyes and the room seemed to quiet in response. The distant hiss of the espresso machine, the shuffle of paper at the teller window, even the soft click of a pen all faded beneath the gravity of her stare. Show me the memo, she said, turning her tablet across so that its dark screen glowed at Karen waiting. The internal bulletin authorizing you to override my credentials. Karen's hand trembled as she reached for the phone at her belt. She tapped her earpiece, her voice an urgent whisper. Yes, do we have that? She hung up and smiled weakly at Isabella. I'm working on it. Marcus James, standing a respectful step behind Isabella, caught Isabella's eye. He gave a subtle nod. Legal counsel was standing by, ready to intervene. Leo Jiang, his smartphone lowered but still recording, watched the drama unfold, his red tally light a silent witness to every moment. Even the branch's security officer, Derek Hayes, hovered at the periphery, his posture a careful balance of duty and uncertainty. After 10 long seconds, an eternity in moments like these, Karen lifted a single sheet of paper from the binder. It was an internal memo stamped confidential. She cleared her throat, voice quavering. Here. Authorization for additional due diligence in cases of discrepancy. She tapped the text with a lacquered fingernail. Documentation not listed elsewhere. Isabella picked up the paper and studied it, her eyes skimming the small print. She held it by one corner and watched it tremble in Karen's grip. Thank you, she said softly. But this memo does not supersede the bank's charter, nor does it authorize the profiling of its majority owner. A murmur rippled through the small cluster of onlookers. Phones' refocused whispers stirred, and the ambient jazz seemed to stutter as though it too questioned the logic of Karen's gambit. Clients shifted in their seats, some rising to better hear, some leaning in conspiratorially. For a moment, Isabella allowed the symphony of hushed astonishment to underscore her point. She opened her own tablet and tapped a few times. The screen sprang to life with the bank's corporate charter sign sealed and indexed, detailing the rights of all shareholders and specifically exempting the primary owner from routine procedural reviews without sufficient cause. She slid the tablet across the counter face up. Section 2.1.1 Immediate executive service guaranteed to all majority stakeholders. No secondary review required. Karen's breath caught as she stared at the screen. A hush descended thick enough to lean into. One brave client, an older gentleman in a linen suit, picked up Isabella's tablet to get a closer look. His eyebrows shot up in shock. Another client, a woman draped in a silk neckerchief, exchanged a glance with her companion and nodded in disbelief. Karen cleared her throat again, blinking rapidly. I was unaware of that clause, she mumbled. She glanced around as if hoping someone else would confirm her confusion. Instead, she saw empty seats, pens abandoned on appointment card tables, and the silent accusation in every witness's eyes. Isabella allowed herself the tiniest nod of satisfaction. Understandable, she said, voice as calm as a still lake. Until now, you've only followed your own assumptions. She rose from her seat, the gentle rise hardly perceptible, but enough to draw full attention. I don't require further verification. I require respect, and I require this branch to comply with its own charter immediately. A tremor passed through the lounge. Karen straightened her spine, summoning the last vestiges of authority. I will see to that, she whispered, voice hollow. Before she could step away, Isabella raised a hand. Don't, she said the single word, both an order and a promise. You will remain here while we resolve this. That command snapped the remaining threads of decorum. Phones were raised to capture the moment. The espresso machine's hiss seemed to applaud her unwavering resolve. Across the room, Leo's phone streamed the scene live captions at the bottom of the screen reading, CEO stands up to branch bias. And through it all, Isabella held her ground. No flourish, no raised voice, only composed authority. In those moments, she wasn't just demanding a policy. She was embodying the guarantee of dignity she had built her empire upon. The hollow veneer of exclusivity had cracked, revealing prejudice at its core. And Isabella Rossi, with a quiet command and a simple tablet, had stripped it bare. The silence stretched as Karen swallowed her carefully constructed excuses, collapsing under the weight of their own absurdity. She jerked her head toward a nearby desk phone and muttered, I need to contact compliance. Please do, Isabella replied. And bring the signed copy of Section 2.1.1 while you're at it. No one moved for a heartbeat longer. Then Karen Miller, face ashen, backed away toward the compliance office, barely glancing over her shoulder as she stumbled out of the private lounge. Derek Hayes, who had hovered uncertainly, sighed and bowed his head, then followed, leaving the counter empty. Isabella turned to Marcus and gave him the tablet. His fingers tapped to close the charter file. She met Leo's gaze. He lowered his phone out of respect and nodded. The clients, released from their stunned silence, began to murmur praise, applause, breaking out softly, as though they too had just witnessed justice reassert itself. In that charged hush, Isabella Rossi stood alone at the center of a room transformed. The composure that had carried her through boardrooms and crisis zones that spanned continents had now shattered a barrier born of bias. No grand speech, no dramatic flourish, just a calm demand for truth backed by undeniable fact. And as she bowed her head in acknowledgement of the small standing ovation, she knew the moment had already rippled beyond these walls. The veneer of exclusivity had been pierced. The quiet roar of accountability was now gathering force. In the luxury of Summit Wealth Bank's private lounge, dignity had reclaimed its rightful throne, and Isabella Rossi stood as its sovereign. Late morning sunlight slanted through the tall windows of Summit Wealth Bank's private client lounge, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Isabella Rossi sat poised at the mahogany transaction desk, her composed silhouette framed by the soft glow of the recessed lighting. Around her, a growing hush rippled through the gilded room. Clients and staff alike sensed a turning tide, though they could not yet name its shape. On the counter before her lay the tremulous binder of police's Karen Miller had tried to invoke. In Isabella's hand rested a sleek smartphone, its screen illuminating her steel blue eyes. 10 minutes earlier, she had been dismissed as an imposter. Now, with a few deliberate taps, she was summoning the very institution she'd founded to account for its misdeeds. She tapped her thumb over the encrypted messaging app that connected her directly to her C-suite team. First to her chief operating officer, a clear, concise line, "Activate Protocol 6 board to the lounge." Senator straight shoulders and tactician's poise defined her COO, Marcus James. Within seconds, a red receipt blinked back at her. Then came the legal notification document, "Everything Prepare Notice." That message, too, flipped to read in heartbeat time. Each keystroke landed with the weight of a gavel echoing in the hidden corridors of corporate power. Against the background murmur, an uneasy mixture of curiosity and tension, the taps on Isabella's screen sounded like drumbeats summoning allies to a decisive battlefield. She set the phone down with calm minimalism. The air around her seemed to thicken, charged by the unspoken anticipation. A hush deepened into something almost sacred. This was no longer a test of one woman's fortitude, but a summons to justice itself. At the far end of the lounge, the glass door swung open quietly. First, her chief of staff, Anita Sharma, breezed in, tablet in hand, her expression one of discreet efficiency. She took position just beyond Isabella's right shoulder, ready to record timestamps and key statements. Behind her followed Leo Zhang, the young tech entrepreneur, who had first raised his phone to stream the confrontation. He lowered the device respectfully, understanding that now the task was not to capture sensation, but to presence the truth in human voices. Moments later, the heavy oaken door at the back of the room opened again, admitting two senior members of the Summit Board of Directors. Their polished shoes tapped once, twice as they strode to the center of the lounge. Papers rustled, tablets lit up, and one of them nodded toward Isabella as if acknowledging a sovereign. At that signal, a dozen pairs of eyes turned to watch the tableau unfold. On each face, client, teller, banker flashed something like recognition. This mattered. This was their bank, their institution under scrutiny. And now the owner herself called them to account. Isabella rose slowly, the gentle rustle of her silk blouse the only sound beneath the swelling hush. She extended a single hand, palm downward, an invitation for attention. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice low but resonant, filling the vaulted space. "In the last 10 minutes, I have been profiled, accused, and humiliated in this very lounge. Protocol 6 is our immediate escalation procedure when a core value is at risk. Today, that value is equity." Her words landed like stones in still water ripples, reaching every corner. She glanced at the board members, their brows furrowing in solemn acknowledgement. Then she turned back to the assembled staff and clients. "I did not raise my voice. I did not storm out. I stood here calmly, and in doing so, I tested the systems we built to protect our clients." A murmur rose, then stilled once more under her steady gaze. She continued, "Those same systems failed me. They failed because they were administered by people who confused authority with entitlement policy with prejudice. So now we are here to correct that failure." Leaning forward, she swept a hand across the desk where Karen Miller's scrambling binders still lay. "This document," she said, "purported to grant you power to question any withdrawal. Yet it neglected to protect the rights of the institution's majority owner. That error allowed personal bias to masquerade as corporate protocol." Her statement was met by a ripple of agreement among the clients, some discreet nods, some small gasps. Leo's lowered camera recorded the moment, but his attention remained respectfully on Isabella, not on the screen. Isabella tapped her phone again, and a projected screen lit up behind her, the charter clause guaranteeing executive immunity from secondary review. Now she said, voice firm, "The board is here to reaffirm that charter. We will not proceed until each of you has reviewed this clause and endorsed it once more." The board members retrieved tablets from Anita's orderly hands and began to scroll. The senior director at Isabella's left pressed his finger to the clause on screen, then looked up at her. His nod was slow, deliberate. Across the room, the reception desk assistant, blonde, anxious, exhaled in relief. The private banker who had whispered doubt earlier crossed her arms and read the screen carefully. Manager Chadwick Vance, lurking by the espresso station, looked as though he'd swallowed air. His smirk was gone, replaced by sober realization. Isabella allowed that tableau to settle before she pressed on. Next, she said, we will begin a full audit of every request denied in the last 6 months, especially those flagged under discrepancy. We will identify where bias entered decision-making, and we will retrain or replace every staff member involved. A board member interjected softly. We already have compliance auditors en route. They will arrive within the hour. He tapped his own device. A confirmation banner flickered across all screens. Excellent, Isabella replied. And during that audit, no client transactions here will be processed. The lounge will remain open, but we will respectfully refer clients to another branch until we have reset our standards. She paused, letting them absorb that the branch would effectively shut down until reform was complete. Gasps of surprise echoed, but then turned to murmurs of approval. The branch's staff exchanged uneasy glances, their power evaporating in the same breath that restored Isabella's dignity. Finally, Isabella closed with a direct charge. We built this bank to serve people, everyone without exception. Today, we repair our promise. Protocol 6 is not a punitive tool. It is a safeguard for our integrity. Let us use it wisely and ensure this never happens again. The collective hush broke into applause, quiet, respectful, but heartfelt. Tablets were lowered. Phones were tucked away. Justice once summoned had arrived. As Isabella took her seat again, Anita leaned close and whispered, Phase 1 complete. Shall we proceed to Phase 2? Isabella nodded. Let's rebuild one standard at a time. And in that moment, Gate 22's polished lounge was no longer merely a room of marble and mahogany. It was the birthplace of a new era for Summit Wealth Bank, where prejudice would find no foothold and dignity held the highest authority. Late afternoon sunlight slanted through the terminal's floor-to-ceiling windows, bathing Gate 22 in a honeyed glow. Erica Monroe stood near the TSA podium, her posture calm yet electric, like a conductor before the crescendo. Behind her, the hum of passenger chatter and rolling suitcases had receded into a charged silence, every set of eyes drawn to the quiet drama unfolding. Then in tandem, two figures slipped through the crowd with practiced discretion. Simone Patel, Erica's seasoned general counsel, and Malik Davis, her PR director known for his unflappable poise under pressure. Simone wore a tailored charcoal blazer, a stack of legal briefs tucked under one arm. Malik's phone was already recording, ready to capture every moment with sympathetic focus. Erica acknowledged them with a slight incline of her chin. She had summoned her allies with a single text, Simone Malik Gate 22, no further explanation needed. Now they took their places, flanking her Simone to the left, offering a legal watchfulness that crackled in the air. Malik to the right, his phone discreetly trained on the TSA agent and the line of passengers. Nearby, a fellow traveler, an onlooker with a sleek business suit and a smartphone, caught the eye of Malik and nodded in understanding. Without a word, he started a live stream, pointing the camera toward Erica's composed figure. The red live icon blinked in the corner of his screen, signaling that what had been a hushed confrontation was now a public spectacle. A ripple of whispers spread through the cafe just beyond the glass partition. Journalists who had been sipping lattes leaned forward, phones raised. A local travel vlogger set aside her iced matcha to capture the scene. It was as though the terminal had erected an invisible stage with Erica Monroe at center court. Simone Patel bent slightly to Erica's ear. They're pushing this to every newsroom in the airport, she murmured. Any second now, they'll send alerts to their editors. Erica's lips curved in a half smile. This was the level of leverage she needed. Malik Davis raised his voice, not loudly, but with enough projection to carry to the nearest group of passengers. Good afternoon, everyone. He began, drawing more heads to swivel in their direction. I'm Malik Davis, spokesperson for Skyway Innovations. You're witnessing an important moment in corporate responsibility and civil rights. He let that hang a beat, letting the liveliness of the scene coalesce into significance. Erica stepped forward one pace. I appreciate your attention, she said, voice steady and clear. Earlier, my name was ridiculed at this checkpoint. Now that incident is being documented and shared, not to humiliate, but to illuminate the critical need for systemic change. She paused to let the words register. Behind the TSA agent station, the line had halted entirely. Travelers stood, some with passports in hand, uncertain whether to advance or retreat. Even the checkpoint supervisor, alerted by his radios, peered around the plexiglass barrier, brow furrowed. The authority structure here had been disrupted. Her hush had summoned an audience. Simone nodded approvingly, then cleared her throat. On behalf of Ms. Monroe and Skyway Innovations, we are filing a formal complaint with TSA headquarters. We will request an immediate policy review concerning name-based profiling. Additionally, we will pursue legal remedies to ensure no other traveler of any background experiences this indignity. Malik lifted his phone so that the stream captured both Simone's pronouncement and Erica's composed presence. If you believe that no one should face such treatment, he said to the growing crowd, please share this live stream, use the hashtag #MonroeEffect, and demand action from airline and security officials. Erica looked directly into the camera lens, her gaze unwavering, her expression both challenge and invitation. Prejudice thrives in silence, she said softly. I chose not to remain silent, and now together we can end it. A murmur of agreement swelled into applause. The newsroom had its headline, the passengers had their story, and Erica Monroe had transformed a moment of personal insult into a catalyst for collective accountability. This was no private delay at a security line. It was a public reckoning captured in real time and destined to reshape policy beyond the walls of Gate 22. With that, she stepped back, offering Simone the floor to finalize the procedural next steps. The tableau held for a moment longer, power bias laid bare under the unforgiving glare of both terminal lights and live stream cameras before the CEO, her counsel, and her PR director turned as one and strode toward the checkpoint supervisor, ready to convert their spectacle into lasting reform. 15 minutes after the initial snub, the atmosphere in the private client lounge had shifted from disbelief to charged anticipation. What began as a stifling moment of bias had blossomed into a battleground of accountability, and now at the center of it all, Isabella Rossi stood like a conductor poised before the final movement of a symphony. Through the glass doors at the far end of the marble-lined room strode the bank's chairman, Gregory Ellison, a man whose crisp navy suit and polished shoes spoke of decades spent in corridors of power. He was flanked by two stern-faced administrators. Emily Tan, the chief compliance officer, clutching a leather-bound folder of policy documents, and Desmond Reyes, the head of human resources. His expression a blend of concern and duty. The trio moved with purpose, parting the cluster of stunned clients and staff as they advanced toward Isabella's table. Isabella rose to meet them, her posture unyielding, her composure absolute. Around her, the room's high ceilings and satin-finished counters seemed to draw closer, as though eager to bear witness to the reckoning about to unfold. The soft glow of recessed lighting highlighted her calm determination. The same steel that had guided her through corporate mergers now tempered her voice for this singular moment. Gregory Ellison paused a respectful distance away. The low rustle of paperwork and the muffled click of smartphone cameras punctuated the silence. He cleared his throat. Ms. Rossi, he began, voice steady, but edged with urgency. I have reviewed the incident report, the video evidence, and the numerous witness statements. It is clear that the behavior you and several others endured was unacceptable and in direct violation of our bank's core values. Isabella gave a slight nod, acknowledging his words without betraying any relief. She knew this was only the opening chord of the climax. She crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering, silently urging him onward. The chairman continued, As chairman of Summit Wealth Bank, I bear ultimate responsibility for the conduct of our branches. The actions taken by Ms. Miller, Ms. Foster, Mr. Vance, and others at this location were inexcusable. Therefore, effective immediately, this regional branch board is dissolved. A collective gasp reverberated through the room. The word dissolved felt like a thunderclap. The branch's governing body, the very team entrusted with safeguarding client dignity, was being dismantled on the spot. Managers who had wielded power here for years now stood without authority, their titles evaporating in that single declaration. Emily Tan stepped forward to the marble-topped table, her leather folder snapping open. With a swift motion, she slid a stack of crisp memoranda across the surface toward Isabella. These documents outline the reconstitution plan. Emily said, voice calm yet firm. We will form a new board under a strict non-discrimination charter, complete with quarterly equity audits, mandatory bias awareness training, and real-time conduct monitoring. Any failure to comply will trigger immediate suspension and review. The administrators exchanged nods as Emily and Desmond laid out the structural blueprint. All future executive appointments must include at least one external diversity officer. Every client complaint, even those dismissed in the past, would be reopened, and a public report of branch performance on equity metrics would be published monthly. This was not a mere apology or a symbolic gesture, it was a fundamental rewiring of the bank's governance. Isabella reached out and picked up the top memorandum, her fingers running over the embossed letterhead. This is a decisive step, she said, her voice low but resonant. But it is only the beginning. True reform requires vigilance and willingness from every level of leadership to hold themselves and their teams accountable. Gregory Ellison met her gaze directly, the weight of his office reflected in his eyes. Agreed. I will personally chair the inaugural Equity Oversight Committee, and I pledge that any branch anywhere in our network that repeats this behavior will face the same swift action. A ripple of relief and applause rippled through the lounge. Clients who had once stared in shocked silence now exchanged approving glances. Some discreetly wiped tears from their eyes, others pressed their palms together in gratitude. The velvet rope of bias had fallen, and in its place, the velvet rope that once delineated privilege was replaced by a mandate of fairness. As the initial applause faded, Isabella allowed herself the slightest of smiles. She glanced around at the individuals who had stood with her, Marcus James, who had stepped forward to quell escalating tension, Chloe Davis, whose voice had rallied the room, Leo Jiang, the quiet tech entrepreneur who had resisted filming in favor of speaking out, Nia Jackson, whose bravery in sharing her own experience had underscored the pervasiveness of the problem. Their courage had fortified her resolve. Their solidarity had amplified her message. Desmond Reyes cleared his throat, signaling that the boardroom overture was complete. He motioned for the administrators to step back. With the old board dissolved and the new charter in place, our next order of business is implementation. Let us convene immediately in the Sky Room to finalize the new director appointments and schedule the first equity audit. Isabella inclined her head. And I will be there. This is not a behind-closed-doors arrangement. We will draft these policies publicly with client representation, staff input, and third-party oversight. Transparency will be our greatest safeguard. Gregory Ellison offered a final nod of respect. Then let us proceed. Summit Wealth's future begins now. As the group moved toward the exit, Isabella at the forefront, the newly empowered administrators in tow, the lounge felt transformed. What had been a glossy antechamber of privilege was now a crucible of justice. Marble floors that once reflected the arrogance of unchecked authority now bore witness to the first steps of systemic change. In that moment, the private lounge, a symbol of exclusivity and elitism, became the birthsite of a new institutional ethos. Isabella Rossi's voice had shattered the gilded veneer of bias, and in the afterglow of that revelation, power was rebalanced. 15 minutes after a CEO was dismissed, she had dissolved an entire board, and with it an entrenched culture of prejudice. As the double doors swung closed behind them, leaving only the fading echo of footsteps and the soft hum of subdued celebration, the final chord of this movement resonated. Justice, once deferred by protocol, had arrived with unrelenting immediacy. The boardroom overture had ended, but the symphony of reform was only beginning. The hush that followed Gregory Ellison's declaration was almost palpable, as though the polished marble walls themselves were pausing to absorb the weight of what had transpired. In that pregnant silence, every client, staff member, and visitor in the private lounge found themselves suspended between the past, when bias ruled unchecked, and the future now being drafted in real time. Phones lay in trembling hands, their cameras still pointed at Isabella and the group of executives. No one dared lower them yet, as if even the slightest movement might shatter the fragile moment of collective awakening. A few anxious fingertips tapped the record buttons. Others simply hovered, capturing the tableau of unlikely reconciliation and immediate justice. Isabella remained at the center of the room, her posture unyielding but open, allowing the full gravity of the moment to settle on everyone present. She glanced toward the receptionist desk where Karen Miller, Brittany Foster, Chadwick Vance, and Stephen Webb now stood, shoulders slumped, faces ashen. Some still clutched the remnants of their previous authority. Landline receivers, tablets, crisp name badges, reminders of a system they had believed unassailable. Now those tokens of power felt hollow. Emily Tan, the chief compliance officer, moved toward a sleek, glass-covered console embedded in the wall, an interactive policy hub summoning the bank's digital frameworks. With a few deft taps, she accessed a blank memorandum template, its header already bearing the Summit Wealth Bank logo. The screen glowed softly, reflecting off the client's astonished eyes. Desmond Reyes, head of HR, and Gregory Ellison stood at Emily's flanks, murmuring approval. Desmond whispered a confirmation of verbatim policy language, all client services subject to equitable review. VIP credentials reviewed under new equity guidelines. The words, when spoken aloud, seemed to hang in the air like a promise, a vow that the bank's future decisions would no longer be cloaked in secrecy or prejudice. A gentle click echoed through the lounge as Emily tapped Save and then Approve. The memorandum materialized on the wall-mounted display in bold typeface, its gravity tangible. Memorandum subject immediate implementation of equity review. Protocol. Effective immediately. Actions. 1. All client service decisions, account verifications, withdrawal requests, appointment scheduling shall be subject to equitable review by a designated ombuds office. 2. VIP credentials and private lounge access cards will be reviewed under new equity guidelines, ensuring no client is barred without transparent justification. 3. Quarterly equity audits will be publicly reported on the bank's website. 4. Any deviation from these protocols will trigger automatic branch reviews and personnel accountability measures. As the words settled onto the high-definition screen, a murmur rippled through the room, less of confusion, more of relief. Clients who had once whispered among themselves now exchanged nods of approval, their whispers turning to soft affirmations. At long last, the bank had codified respect into its DNA. Isabella stepped forward, her voice resonating in the sudden stillness. "This memorandum is not a performative gesture," she said. "It is a binding commitment. From this moment on, every client who steps through these doors, regardless of attire, station, or skin, will be afforded the same dignity, clarity, and respect we claim to champion." Her words stirred something deep within the gathered crowd. A middle-aged man in a tailored suit, who had sat quietly near the espresso bar, reached out to rest a hand on the shoulder of the young Latina next to him, offering a small, grateful smile. A corporate lawyer, his laptop open on the side table, tapped furiously at the keyboard, no doubt drafting a public statement or an announcement for the bank's intranet. Even the once proud barista-turned-private banker Brittany Foster looked on with a mixture of shame and wonder, as though she could scarcely believe her own ears. Gregory Ellison folded his hands and nodded solemnly. "I've signed off on this memorandum," he added, raising a digital pen that glowed red in the ambient light. On the screen, a signature line filled in with his name and the date. A soft chime marked the completion of the process. Desmond Reyes offered a final remark. Effective immediately, all staff must familiarize themselves with this protocol. Training sessions begin tomorrow. Non-compliance is no longer an option. The collective understanding in the room was electric. Where there had been fear, there was now empowerment. Where there had been whispers of doubt, there was consensus on the path forward. And where there had been laughter at Isabella's expense, there was now applause, steady, respectful, and genuine. Phones lowered, replaced by handshakes and eye contact. A few brave souls approached Isabella to offer quiet words of support. Leo Zhang, the tech entrepreneur who had held back from filming, simply nodded and said, "Thank you for doing this for all of us." Nia Jackson, clutching her phone against her chest, whispered, "Now I believe change can happen." Isabella acknowledged each gesture with a nod. She didn't need to speak. The memorandum on the wall spoke volumes. The policy change, hammered out in minutes rather than months, stood as proof that injustice need not linger. When confronted with prejudice, swift and resolute action could indeed reshape an institution in real time. And so the private lounge, once a gilded chamber of exclusion, transformed into a sanctuary of accountability. The marble floors bore the imprint of decisive footsteps, rather than the echo of injustice. The polished counters bore witness to the birth of a new era, one where every client, regardless of background, could enter with confidence that their identity would be honored, not questioned. In that charged moment, Summit Wealth Bank did more than revise a policy. It reaffirmed a fundamental truth that dignity is not a privilege of the few, but a right of all. And as the final echoes of handshakes faded into the quiet hum of the computers, one fact lingered: prejudice, once entrenched, had yielded to policy, written, approved, and activated in the span of a single pivotal afternoon. The moment Isabella Rossi stepped away from the gleaming policy screen, the private lounge seemed to hold its breath. Out in the main banking hall, whispers transformed into murmurs and murmurs swelled into conversations. A soft chime announced a push notification on hundreds of phones. Summit Wealth Bank's app had just broadcast the new equity memorandum, sparking an instant ripple across digital channels. Outside travelers paused mid-stride through the terminal's corridors, tapping curved screens and sharing glances of astonishment. By late afternoon, Twitter feeds and LinkedIn timelines were alight with the hashtag Rossi effect. Within minutes, the story had catapulted beyond banking circles into mainstream news. Summit Wealth CEO shatters bias in private lounge rewrites. Policy in Real Time proclaimed one headline. A prominent financial blog ran the banner, "A Masterclass in Corporate Accountability," overlaying a still frame of Isabella's unwavering stance. Another outlet dissected the memorandum's language, praising its clarity and immediacy. Never has a bank so swiftly codified respect into policy. Back in the lounge, Isabella observed the shifts with composed satisfaction. Clients who had once felt the tension of exclusion now exchanged respectful nods as they passed her by. An elderly gentleman in a tailored gray suit stopped at her side, offering a firm handshake that carried decades of unspoken solidarity. "Well done, Ms. Rossi," he said, voice low but filled with admiration. "We all saw what happened here." Nearby, a young couple rose from their seats to give a nod of approval. The husband offered Isabella a subtle thumbs up. His wife smiled warmly, her eyes reflecting relief that such a powerful figure had dared to confront privilege head-on. Across the room, even the bank tellers, many of whom had been uncertain minutes before, now moved with a quiet pride, greeting each client with genuine courtesy rather than rote protocol. Isabella slipped her tablet back into its slim leather case, its contents now redundant. Everything she had needed to prove her authority and her worth had been written into Summit's policy live, under the gaze of every witness. She allowed herself a small exhalation as she tidied the lapels of her cashmere sweater. The soft hum of the espresso machine felt less imposing. Now its earlier taunts replaced by the gentle hiss of solidarity as baristas shared the news with a few hearty smiles. Her general counsel, Desmond Reyes, approached with discreet deference. "Corporate is monitoring social sentiment," he reported in a low voice. "Engagement metrics are through the roof. Positive sentiment is at 98%. They're preparing a press release to go out in the next hour." Isabella nodded, appreciating the immediacy. "Excellent," she replied. "Let them see that accountability isn't just a talking point." A few steps away, Marcus James, once a silent observer, now her steadfast ally, caught her eye. He raised a hand in salute. "Impact beyond these walls," he said. "Boardroom discussions are already underway. Other branches will follow suit by this time tomorrow." That was all the confirmation she needed. The change she ignited at Summit Wealth Bank would spread, not fade. Clients who had been waiting at the tellers now spoke openly of the afternoon's events. A mid-level executive confessed to a colleague, "I never imagined we'd see the CEO dissolve her own board on the spot." But it was the only way. His colleague nodded emphatically. "That's the kind of leadership this industry needs." Across the lounge, reporters packed up their gear, exchanging business cards and planning follow-up stories. They jostled for quick quotes, eager to capture the next soundbite from Summit's inner circle. One journalist approached Isabella's PR director, tapping notes into her phone. "What's the next step for CEO Rossi?" "She's on her way to a client town hall," came the answer. From there, she'll lead training sessions on the new equity guidelines. Isabella herself stayed on the periphery, letting the satisfaction of a job well done wash over her. In that quiet moment, she reflected on the irony. The private client lounge, once a gilded cage of exclusion, had become the crucible for institutional reform. What began as prejudice masquerading as policy had ended in policy anchored in respect. As the last of the clients dispersed, some heading to adjacent conference rooms, others tapping destination screens to rearrange their flight plans. Isabella retrieved her light jacket from a waiting valet stand. The sky outside had turned to a muted gold, the terminal windows framing streaks of sunset against the city skyline. She paused at the doorway, offering a final glance back at the lounge where history had been written. A young banker caught up to her as she stepped onto the polished floor. "Ms. Rossi, thank you for seeing us," he said earnestly. "You gave voice to those of us who've been silent too long." Isabella smiled, a genuine warm curve of her lips. "No," she corrected him gently. "You found your voice today. I just pointed the way." And with that, she walked out into the evening light, her confidence unshaken, her dignity intact, her power reaffirmed not by privilege, but by principle. In the days and weeks to come, the Hatch-Rossi effect would not only reshape Summit Wealth Bank, it would ripple through corporate boardrooms, regulatory halls, and every institution where bias dared to hide behind procedure. For now, though, the hush she left behind was not the silence of exclusion, but the quiet promise of lasting change.